relatively simple with the anatomy of the heart, and then the second half of this chapter is where things sort of get complicated as we start looking at cardiovascular function. So, not so much today, but Friday and Monday we'll have some challenging material to get to. All right. So the heart in the chest, it's. I want you to note that it sits very anteriorly. So literally, it's just underneath the sternum. You know, the breastbone. The heart, everybody knows, points to the left, right? It isn't so much that the heart is on the left side, though. You know, like when we go to put our hands on our hearts, we miss, typically, because the heart is actually more in the center than it is off to one side. But it does point towards the left. That the pointy part at the left, that we call that the apex. And the flat part, sort of at the top, we call the base. So that's a little confusing because, you know, an apex of a thing is its topmost part. But in the heart, what we're talking about is not topmost, but pointy. So the apex of the heart is the pointy part that points to the left, and the base is the flat part where the vessels go in, essentially. All right. Okay. So the heart, like blood vessels, in some ways the heart is an extension of the vascular system. It has a lot of similarities to what you find in the arterial system. So just like arteries have three layers, that tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa, the heart also has three layers, but we give them different names. So the innermost layer, so this is where the blood is in the heart, right? The wall of those chambers containing blood, we call that the endocardium. And the first layer of the endocardium is endothelium. And that word ought to sound familiar because we talked about it in the last chapter. So just like vessels are lined with endothelial cells, the heart itself on the inside is also lined with endothelial cells. That sort of makes sense because endothelium evolved to be slick and smooth to red blood cells. So as red blood cells are passing through the heart and getting squeezed out, the endothelium makes sure that they don't stick to the walls at all. All right, so that's this innermost layer, the endocardium. This middle layer is called the myocardium, and this is where the muscular cells of the heart are. So of the three layers, the myocardium is by far the largest. And it's the myocardium that does the work of the heart. That is, contracting to push blood into the circulatory system, either to the lungs or to the systemic, or to the rest of the body. So we have the myocardium with the cardiac cells. And then the outermost layer, which is right here, we call that the epicardium. And the epicardium doesn't come up very much. But essentially, it's the covering of the heart. Now, the heart itself is in a kind of bag, which we're going to talk about in a minute, called the pericardium. But the epicardium is inside the bag on the surface of the heart. So just to sort of orient you there. So three sort of concentric layers. All right. So skeletal or cardiac muscle cells are sort of in between smooth muscle cells and skeletal muscle cells in terms of what they're like. So when we talked about muscle last semester, we talked a little bit about how, you know, muscle is one of the primary tissue types, right? There's epithelium, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle. That should sound a little familiar. Everything in the body is one of those four things. Well, there's three kinds of muscle. There's smooth muscle, there's skeletal muscle, and there's cardiac muscle. And we talked a lot about skeletal muscle last semester. You know, we talked about actin and myosin and sarcomeres and that sliding filament mechanism. Well, it turns out that cardiac muscle shares some features with skeletal muscles and then some other features with smooth muscle. So what it shares with skeletal muscle is cardiac muscle has myofibrils, in other words, has those long chains of sarcomeres, right, that when they contract, they shorten. The cardiac muscle has sarcomeres. So when you look at it under the microscope or under the electron microscope, you see this, what should be a familiar pattern where you have your thin filaments and your thick filaments sort of organized in this kind of hexagonal, very orderly fashion. And because there are sarcomeres, there are striations. So striation is just an alternating pattern of light and dark. So when you look at skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle under the microscope, what you see is banding, where, and this obviously doesn't project very well, but you see these bands going up and down in this picture that make these cells sort of look ripply. Those are called striations, and they're a direct result of having sarcomeres. So it's sarcomeres that make these striations. So all three of those things cardiac muscle has in common with skeletal muscle. But it also has some features in common with smooth muscle. One of those is the cells are quite small. So remember, in skeletal muscle, during development, multiple cells join together into these giant multinucleated cells, right? That can run the length of the entire muscle. Well, in cardiac muscle, it's arranged a little bit more like smooth muscle is. And that is, instead of having big cells that have all combined, we still have the original, or we have multiple cells that are connected together. And each one of those cells has just one nucleus. So like here's one cardiac muscle cell here, here's its nucleus, and then this bumpy thing here and here, that's where it's going to connect to its neighboring cardiac muscle cell. Okay, we call that an intercalated disc, which I'll talk more about in a minute. All right, so small cells, one nuclei per cell, and gap junctions. So smooth muscle, we learned a little about anyway, that in order for smooth muscle to work right, it has to sort of all contract together. Well, the way that that is done is the cells are connected through gap junctions. And in the endocrine chapter, we talked a little bit about what a gap junction was, but it's essentially like this. So if this is a cell and this is a cell, a gap junction allows very small things to pass right from the inside of one cell into another. What we see playing a big role in cardiac muscle is calcium. So as calcium moves from one cell to the next, it triggers contraction as it goes. So just like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle cells are connected to each other, not just physically, but chemically. So that changes in one cell can affect the neighboring cell. Because just like smooth muscle, in order for the heart to do its job, all the cardiac cells have to contract in a coordinated way, right? Because they're too small to do anything on their own. So they all have to contract together in order to make the chambers of the heart smaller and actually push any blood out. Okay? All right. So one feature that's unique to cardiac muscle is these dark bands. So here's one, there's sort of half of one there. Those are called intercalated discs. And they're the area where one cardiac muscle cell connects to another. And they have two principal features that are sort of important. One we've already talked about, which is gap junctions. So in an intercalated disc, there's two specialized junctions there. One is the gap junctions, and the other are what are called desmosomes. And desmosomes are a little bit like rivets that hold metal together. They have a flat part on the inside of the cell and a flat part on the inside of the other cell, and then they have a very tough protein connecting those two. So while the gap junctions allow communication from cell to cell, the desmosomes hold these cells very tightly together, which sort of, again, makes sense, because as the heart contracts, there's going to be forces trying to pull these cells apart, right? Because the blood is going to push back against that contraction. So in order to have the heart be strong as it's contracting and not break apart, we need to have these desmosomes holding cells very tightly together so that as the heart contracts, the force goes into the blood instead of into separating cells. So intercalated discs have desmosomes and gap junctions, and they keep the cardiac muscle cells bound tightly together. All right. Okay. So sort of zooming back out to look at the gross anatomy, or the macroscopic anatomy, we have this region in the body that gets a lot of attention called the mediastinum. And essentially, it's sort of column-shaped, right? And it sits right here in the center of the chest. So if you were to look at somebody's neck and imagine a tube going down all the way to their abdomen through the chest, that's sort of the mediastinum. And in that space is a bunch of important stuff. Namely, you've got the heart in there, you've got the trachea, which is taking air to the lungs. The esophagus is in the back, which is transporting food down into the stomach. And then all along the front here, we have the great vessels, or the veins returning blood to the heart, or the arteries coming out of the heart to take blood to the rest of the body. So it's this space right here that's called the mediastinum. That word really just means middle of the chest, but mediastinum. And if we look at it in cross-section, again, now we can see that it's sort of round. Here in this picture it looks sort of square, but in the other dimension it's sort of column-shaped. And I like this picture because it shows two important things. One is how anterior in the chest the heart is. I think sometimes we think that the heart is sort of buried deep in the chest, and it isn't. It sits very much in the middle, and that's another thing I like about this picture, is it shows you the heart isn't over here where we put our hands at all. It's actually sort of in the center. It just points to the left. So we can see here, here's the heart in cross-section, right? Here's the sternum. So all that separates the heart from the outside world is the sternum and some connective tissue. So it's literally right underneath the chest. So like if you get the opportunity to see open heart surgery, when they open the ribs, boom, the heart is right there. The pericardium is right there. You don't have to go digging for it. All right, so heart is very interior. And then the other thing I like about this picture has more to do with the lungs. And that is the lungs, we think of them as sort of to the left and to the right. But one of the biggest parts of them are actually posterior. So the heart is anterior, the lungs are predominantly posterior. So not only do the lungs sit on the left and right, they also sort of wrap around almost behind the heart as well, except that the spinal cord is in the way. But so like we get into the cadaver lab, which I hope you guys will have to work that out with your lab instructor. But when you see the lungs, you'll see that most of the lung is actually in the back. So like when you learn to listen to patients' breath sounds, which some of you will learn, one of the things that they'll tell you is you can't just listen from the front. And the reason for that is because most of the lungs are in the back. So if you only listen in the front, you're going to miss like 2/3 of the lung volume in terms of listening. So even though it's a pain to get patients up to listen to them, you sort of have to do it in order to hear all of their lungs and not just part of their lungs. All right, so mediastinum. Now, what about all these anatomical terms? Many of them are repeats from that diagram of the great vessels that we looked at in the last chapter. So I still want you to know, like pulmonary trunk, pulmonary vein, those ones. But I wouldn't spend a lot of time, in detail on this anatomy. It's really just to show you the shape of the mediastinum. All right, so here's the heart, here's the aortic arch, here's the trachea going down into the lungs, and here's the esophagus. And then all the way at the back, here's the spinal, or the vertebral column, and then inside the spinal column, here's the spinal cord. So going sort of from front to back. So the mediastinum, very busy place. It certainly is not a place you want to have any kind of trauma because all of these important things are very close together. So, you know, one of the reasons we try to protect our central chest is because of all the stuff in the mediastinum. All right. So the heart lives in a leathery sac called the pericardium. And the reason it does is the heart is very mobile. As it contracts, it not only changes its internal shape, but externally it moves a little. So the human heart, as it beats, it sort of twists on the base. So, you know, on this, you know, the axis is sort of in this direction. And so it twists and gets smaller. So the only way that the heart can move totally separately from all that other stuff in the mediastinum is for it to be separate somehow. And the way that it's kept separate is by being in this fluid-filled sac called the pericardium. And it's a little hard to visualize, but the classic example is this. If you take a balloon and you inflate it, and you put your fist into the balloon, you know, as long as you didn't inflate it, you know, to very high pressure, the balloon will sort of wrap around your fist. That's what the pericardium is like. In the example, your fist is the heart. The part of the balloon that's touching your hand, that is the lining of the outside wall of the heart called the epicardium, like we talked about. And then the part of the balloon that isn't touching your hand, but is instead touching the balloon that's touching your hand, so this wall right here, that is the pericardium, or the sac itself. So in our picture here, the pericardial sac has been cut open so we can see the heart down inside. So this area right here, the pericardium is very tightly bound to these vessels. But then here, there's an honest-to-goodness space between the outside layer of the heart and the inside layer of this leathery sac called the pericardium. And in this space, which is called the pericardial cavity, or pericardial space, in the normal healthy heart, all you find there is a small amount of slippery fluid, you know, almost thin oil-like. So the heart has this sort of lubrication around it, and then this sac is covering it so that it can move independently of the surrounding tissues. So when we look at the, do I have a picture? No, I don't. When we look at the mediastinum in the front, what we usually see is, the pericardium has been removed here too. But, okay, so here's the heart, here's the epicardium, and then here is the pericardium. So the heart lives in this sac that contains a small amount of slippery fluid. Now, anytime there's a space like this that is normally empty or mostly empty, it's clinically relevant because it can be filled with something in disease. So, for example, in rheumatic heart disease, which is an autoimmune disease, the pericardial cavity fills up, instead of with a slippery fluid, it fills up with a sticky, sort of thready fluid instead. And left untreated, it can actually restrict the motion of the heart, and that can reduce cardiac function. Yeah.
What's like the most fluid that can be in there without it actually filling?
Because the pericardium doesn't stretch very easily. So when there gets to be a lot of fluid, it starts to squeeze the heart until the heart can't expand anymore. That's called a tamponade.
My mom had something like that, where they would take fluid off of the heart.
Yeah, pericardiocentesis, they call that.
Yeah.
You're never going to get probably more than 500 cc's out of there.
I know they got a lot of something.
Yeah.
Some part of the body right there, but I remember that.
It was either a pericardium or it was the pleural cavity. That's another space. The lungs have a system like this too, where they sit in a bag like that has a space around it, so it could have been either thing. But yes, sometimes we have to stick a needle in here and draw off whatever's in there that doesn't belong. So the pericardium and the pericardial space. All right, well, here is a good anatomy slide. So you note on the bottom here, I say you should know all the anatomy on this slide. Because heart anatomy is important. And, you know, I think the reasons are obvious. You know, the heart is a mission critical or a homeostasis critical organ, right? So we have two views here. We have an anterior view, that's looking at the heart from the front. Here's the posterior view, looking at the heart from the back. So this you can see, you know, if you take the ribs off, so to speak, and look down at the heart, you can see this. This, you kind of have to take the heart out to see it. And my understanding is you guys did some work with sheep hearts. Was that this week? Was that yesterday? Last week? Okay. So some of this you should have heard before, but there are a few differences between the sheep heart and the human heart. I'm sure you guys talked about that. But here on the outside surface, so we'll start in the front. An interesting rule of thumb is the human heart has rotated towards the left side, which means that when we look at the front of the heart, the anterior heart, most of what we're seeing is the right side of the heart. So right goes with front and left goes with back in the heart. And that can just sort of help you stay, you know, organized. In other animals, you know, like dogs and cats, you know, if you look at Fido from the front, right, he's oval shaped like this, right? You know, because you know, here's his nose, here's his ears, and if you look at his body is oval shaped up and down. The human is oval shaped like this. So the reason our heart sits to the left, it's evolution in action. You know, in an oval like this, the heart can sort of sit straight. You know, it points sort of dead center down. But as our chest got thinner and thinner front to back, the heart ran out of room. So it had to rotate over to the side. So why does Fido have an oval like this and we have an oval like this? It probably has to do with either cliff climbing or tree climbing. You know, because our chest is flat and wide as opposed to deep and thin, it gives us better leverage against flat surfaces. So it makes us better climbers, essentially. So that's probably part of it, is that as the primates took to the trees, their chest cavity changed shape so that they could climb better. But in the process, the heart had to do something because it wouldn't fit in the chest anymore. So it turned to the left. All right, so all that to say, the front part of the heart is the right and the posterior is the left. Okay, so here's the right atrium. The right atrium has kind of a thin wall. This is where blood from the body enters the heart, is in the right atrium, through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, which you can't see in this picture, but it looks a little bit like that. From the right ventricle, we go into the right, or from the right atrium, we go into the right ventricle. The right ventricle ejects blood into the pulmonary trunk, which is right here. Blood comes back to the heart into the left atrium. So here in the back, there's the left atrium. And then from left atrium to left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle, boom, out through the aorta. So in terms of anatomy, here's the right atrium, here's the right ventricle, here's the edge of the left ventricle right here. Here's just sort of the corner of the left atrium, is all you can see from the front. The arteries that supply the heart live in these little fat bundles called sulcuses. So we have in the front, we have an anterior interventricular sulcus. Now don't let the words get you worried. Anterior means the one in the front. Interventricular means between the ventricles. So just like interstate highways take you from state to state, interventricular means between the ventricles. And a sulcus is just a groove, right? So these vessels live in a kind of groove between the ventricles in the front. So anterior interventricular sulcus. All right. The sulcus right along the right atrium is just called the coronary sulcus, which is right here. Both of the atria have ears and called auricles. The floppy part of your ear on the outside is also called your auricle. So this is your auricle. Somebody thought this looked like an ear. I never see it, but somebody thought so. But basically, the auricles are just little sort of extensions of the larger atrium. So the right atrium has an auricle, it's right here. The left atrium has an auricle. It's right here. All right. So pulmonary trunk is going to take blood to the lungs. Between the aortic arch and the pulmonary trunk is this little thread of tissue called the ligamentum arteriosum. And this plays a role in the fetal blood flow. So prior to delivery, this is not just a thread of tissue. It's a vessel that connects the pulmonary trunk with the aortic arch so that the lungs in the developing fetus, very little blood goes to the lungs because there's sort of no point in sending blood to the lungs. There's no air in there, right? So instead of using the lungs to oxygenate, the baby uses mom's lungs through the placenta. So this is one of the bypass routes. In the developing fetus, instead of all of the blood going to the lungs, which is pointless, much of the blood just dumps right into the aorta instead. So it sort of bypasses the lungs and goes back out to the body. So ligamentum arteriosum. And, okay, so that's all the front pieces. Okay, in the back, so here's the left atrium. On a specimen, the easiest way to identify the left atrium, it will be the thing with 4 holes in it. Because the way the veins come back from the lungs, there's a top and bottom and a left and right. So there's 4 holes, 4 entrances to the left atrium. So blood coming back from the lungs enters the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood goes into the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is the larger of the two. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And then from the left ventricle, it goes out through the aorta in front. All right, so aortic arch, pulmonary arteries, superior and inferior vena cava. There again, in a specimen, they usually line up. In other words, if you pass like a pencil from the superior vena cava into the inferior vena cava, it's sort of a straight line because the two, they come in like this, so on the same path, and then they join at the right atrium. In the back, again, we see the coronary sulcus right here. The coronary sinus is here, and you really only see it from the back. The coronary arteries supply blood to the heart. The coronary sinus takes the blood back away. So it's the principal vein for the heart is the coronary sinus. And it actually empties directly into the right atrium. So the blood doesn't go very far. For the coronary arteries, it comes out at the base of the aorta and it goes right back in at the coronary sinus. So it's very close to the circulation. Just like there's an anterior interventricular sulcus, there's a posterior one too. When we get to the coronary artery slide, we'll see what is contained in those, but it's branches of the coronary artery. All right? So posterior surface, anterior surface of the heart. Okay. So if we clean out some of that fat from the sulcuses, we can start to see what lives there. And what lives there are the very important coronary arteries, which I know everybody in the room has heard of these before. So why coronary? What does that word mean? Corona means crown. And because these vessels sort of encircle the heart, like a round crown would, they got the name coronary arteries. Okay. So there's 2 of them, and then each has branches. So there's a left coronary artery that comes out of the aorta. So here's the aortic arch. The first 2 branches of the aorta are the coronary arteries. And sometimes that will appear on a test. What are the first 2 branches of the aortic from the aorta? And it's the left coronary and right coronary. So just as the aorta leaves the heart, the left coronary artery comes out on the left side by the left atrium. The right coronary artery comes out on the right side by the right atrium. And then the left vessel goes down and around. So it goes down and towards the back. So we have 2 branches. So first, the left coronary artery is here, and it branches to form the circumflex. Circumflex just means to go around. So it's going to go around the back of the heart. And then down the anterior interventricular sulcus, is going to be the anterior interventricular artery. Now, nobody calls it that. Everybody calls it the left anterior descending, or the LAD. Sometimes they try to change the names of things in anatomy, but because everybody learns it one way, the old names never die. So essentially, just you add names to things. So anterior interventricular, left anterior descending. This is also called the widowmaker because a clot in the left anterior descending is probably going to kill you because it supplies part of the right ventricle as well as part of the left ventricle. So with a big clot in this artery, and you're probably not going to make it, or you're going to end up with massive heart failure at the end. All right. So that's the left coronary. The right coronary artery, it comes along in here, and then it wraps around the back, which we'll pick it up here in a minute. But the right coronary artery has some branches called marginal arteries, as does the anterior interventricular. So, like I said before, the left is the front and left side. The right is the right side and back. All right. I think we have another picture. Yes, good. So that was from the front. Here's looking at it from the back. Okay, so here's the circumflex artery, so coming along from the left coronary artery, and then it makes a final dive down as just a marginal artery. So the left coronary artery really supplies the left ventricle. The right coronary artery has made its way around the right atrium, and then it too makes a beeline down the interventricular sulcus, and here is the posterior interventricular artery, also called the right posterior descending. So you have a left anterior descending coming along the front, middle of the heart, and on the back you have a right posterior descending going along the posterior interventricular area, right? Okay. So remember, the circumflex is a branch of the left coronary artery, and posterior descending, right posterior descending. There aren't very many arteries here, right? And coronary arteries, because they come up in clinically all the time, you can be guaranteed a question or two on coronary arteries. So do know, I'm not asking you to know a lot here, but know the left, know the right, know the anterior descending, know the posterior descending, and the circumflex artery. Because they come up clinically, right? Okay. So how does blood get back into the heart? Well, through the cardiac veins. Now, these don't come up clinically as often as the arteries do. You know, the arteries come up in the care of patients. That's what I mean by clinically, in the care of patients, because of myocardial infarction, right, and cardiovascular disease. The veins not affected as much. Pretty much the veins follow the arteries until you get to the end. So just like there is here's that left anterior descending. Well, coming up alongside it is what's called the great cardiac vein. So it comes up and then it follows the circumflex artery around. So here we pick it up on the back side. This is front, this is back. The great cardiac vein then eventually joins up with the coronary sinus. And then in the interventricular sulcus in the back, there's a posterior cardiac vein here. And so the great cardiac and the posterior cardiac join together. And then the last branch is the middle cardiac, and they all together form the coronary sinus. So for the most part, the veins follow the arteries. They just have different names. All right. So make a note of this box. This is, you may see a picture similar to this on the exam with parts label, right? So this is a double asterisk slide. And the reason for that, it's not busy work. You can't really understand how the heart works unless you understand its parts, its anatomy. So what we looked at just a little while ago was the external surface. If we cut the heart open, we can start to see, the complexity on the inside. All right, so first off, blood flow through the heart. This is one that you just plain have to know, right? Is how do you know how the heart works if you don't know how the pattern of blood flow? All right, so we'll start with blood from the body, right? Blood from the body enters the heart at I see you messed it up right from the beginning. The right atrium, the left atrium. So right atrium. Okay, so that's through the inferior and superior vena cava. So those are the two vessels that fill the right atrium. And in our picture here, the right atrium is this guy right here. Okay, so the superior and inferior vena cava bring blood from the body and then into the right atrium. So if you had a question that said, where does blood enter the heart from the systemic circulation? The answer is right atrium. It's the collector, so to speak. It collects the blood from the body to put it through the cardiac cycle. All right. So then we go from right atrium into right ventricle. And there's a valve between those two things. So right atrium, right ventricle, valve. So from right atrium to right ventricle. And what does it pass through? That symbol is just passing through the right AV valve, atrioventricular valve. That's its proper name today. It has one other name. The right atrial or the right AV valve is also known as the tricuspid valve. So see, it's here. And this is one of these times when you would like me to tell you, you just have to memorize one name. Not on the two AV valves. You have to know all their names because people are going to talk about them using the other names. So you sort of have to know both. So in this case, the right atrioventricular valve, atrioventricular, atrio is atrium, ventricular is ventricle, right? So it's the valve between the atrium and ventricle. But unfortunately, the old school anatomists didn't always think like that. They like to name things for other descriptions. So for the right AV valve, it's called the tricuspid because it has three cusps, three leaves. A cusp of a thing is a point, and the tricuspid valve has three of those, has 3 points that all come together. So right AV is also the tricuspid. Here, we'll just put that tricuspid. Okay. So then where to from there? Well, we're in the right ventricle, so blood is going to go next into the pulmonary trunk, and to do so, it has to cross through that valve right there. That's the pulmonary valve. So we're going to head to, I guess we'll put pulmonary trunk. And what does it pass through to do that? That's the pulmonic. And we're going to talk more about the valves here in a minute, but I figured this is a good slide to go through this order of things through the heart. So from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonic valve. Then we're going to go to the lungs. Right? Now, from the lungs, we're going to go sort of up. So from lungs, blood returns to the heart through the left atrium. And what it passes through is the pulmonary veins. Okay? So that brings us here. So we've changed color. This is blue blood. When blood goes to the lungs and comes back, it comes back red. So we have our oxygenated blood coming in through the pulmonary veins here. So then from the left atrium, which is right here, to the left ventricle, we're going to pass through another valve. So left ventricle. And the valve we pass through is the left AV valve. That's its proper name, but it has two other names. It's also called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. Now, thankfully, that's the only valve that has three names, right? So between the left atrium and the left ventricle, there's the left AV valve, also called the bicuspid, also called the mitral. Why is it called bicuspid? Because the right AV valve has 3 leaflets, and the left AV valve has 2. So it's bicusped, or 2 cusps, 2 flaps. Why do we call it the mitral valve? This one has a little story attached. A mitre is a hat that, when you look at it, it looks like that. If you look at it straight on, they tell me that a bishop wears a mitre hat. But essentially, it sits sort of like this, and when this valve is closed, it looks a little bit like a mitre hat. So we call it the mitral valve. That's its oldest name, is the mitral valve. All right, so now we're on the left ventricle, and we're going to head back out to the body. So between the left ventricle and the aorta, there's a valve that looks just like this. We just can't see it because it's back here. That's the aortic valve. So from left ventricle, we go into the aorta. And to do that, we pass through the aortic valve. Then from the aorta, blood goes out to the body and eventually comes back into this system. So we have the cycle. So from the body, through the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, into the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood moves to the right ventricle, through the right AV valve, also called the tricuspid. From the right ventricle, blood heads towards the lungs by going through the pulmonary trunk after it passes through the pulmonic valve. From the lungs, blood comes back through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. From left atrium to left ventricle, so we're here from left atrium to left ventricle, blood passes through the bicuspid valve, also called the left AV, also called the mitral, into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle into the aorta, passing through the aortic valve. All right? So that's a lot of information, right? But we're gonna look at this information in multiple ways through the rest of this chapter. So, but I like this diagram. This is sort of how I think, is, one step after another, and this one closes a loop, so it's circular. But you'll see in the PowerPoints that there's sort of other presentations of this same information. All right. Some anatomy we didn't cover. Okay, so the AV valves are sort of floppy, and in order to function, in order to stay closed, they have to be tethered down. So the tethers on the edge here are called chordae tendineae, so this word here. And the best way to think of them is the strings on a parachute. The AV valves are sort of parachute-like. When blood tries to go in the wrong direction, it fills these parachute-like valves and slams them shut. What the chordae tendineae do is hold on to the edge of that parachute so that the valve doesn't flop open the other direction. So chordae tendineae are connected to little muscle extensions called papillary muscles. So the papillary muscles, together with these chordae tendineae, help to keep these valves closed, the AV valve. So here on the right side, we have tendineae and papillary muscle. Left side, we have tendineae and 2 papillary muscles, right? All right. What else is on this slide? The fossa ovalis, which is right here. This is a flap that connects the right atrium with the left atrium, again, in fetal development. So just like the ligamentum arteriosum connects the right side of the heart with the left side of the heart in the fetus, so does the fossa ovalis. So it allows another shortcut for blood to bypass the lungs. But in the adult, you can still see it oftentimes, but it isn't a flap anymore. It's sealed shut. All right, okay. I think we got the trabeculae. As you probably saw in the sheep heart, when you open up the ventricles, they're not smooth, right? They have this sort of, fancy articulated pattern inside. those little strings and struts, or we just call those trabeculi. So our hearts are the same way. You know, they're not smooth inside. They sort of have this complicated three-dimensional, it's sort of pretty, I think, shape to it. But it's just a remnant of how the heart forms in the first place. All right. Let's do some questions, and then that'll probably finish us up for today. All right. The ear-like extension of the atrium is the what? So don't forget to get your homework in. All right, go get everybody 1, 2, 3. Oh man, okay, so that's everybody. That's an auricle. An auricle is supposedly ear-like extension. It's the easiest way to identify it is its shape is sort of triangular when you look at it from the side, and its walls are particularly thin. But yes, both atria have an auricle. All right. The circumflex branch and the anterior interventricular are branches of which of those? All right, a little bit of a split, but the answer there is B, the left coronary artery. Circumflex goes with left. So if you can keep that one straight, you can usually sort out the other ones. Left coronary artery. All right, last one. The bicuspid or the mitral valve is located where? We've got like it's split between the two. The correct answer there is E. The bicuspid mitral is the left AV valve. The right, between the right atrium and right ventricle, that's the right atrioventricular valve. That's the tricuspid valve. So have a plan for keeping the tricuspid and bicuspid separate in your mind because people confuse the two. All right, that's it. We're out of time for today. I'll see you guys on Friday.